Okay, that was a client calling me. He wants to pay me 3 times what my bill was. I just can't do that in good conscience, you know? It's like, you got to be careful about, the people from whom you take money and how much they pay you. Right, George? You know what I'm talking about. Okay, so Ronald Reagan made 2 statements. And so, why am I going back? That's ancient history. Well, it isn't ancient history. I mean, if you wanted ancient history, I can take you back to the before the American Revolution to see the evolution of all of these issues. But it's because it's relevant to what's going on today. So, with Ronald Reagan, he said 2 things that just irritated the hell out of me at the time, and they still do. The first one was, he said, what are the most, I'm paraphrasing, what's the most chilling words you can ever hear? Hi, I'm from the federal government and I'm here to help you. Well, you know something? All these Republicans who applauded that, if they happen to live in the South, which is like solid Republican these days, and they get hit by tornadoes, and somebody comes along and says, I'm from the federal government and here's some cash, well, they're not saying, oh, those are chilling words. I don't want to hear them say, oh yeah, gimme, gimme, gimme. All right? Now, I'm not saying they shouldn't gimme, 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 but don't go gimme, 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 and then complain about the federal government and go vote for Republicans who don't want to give you anything. So that was the first stupid thing that he said. The second stupid thing, it wasn't stupid. This was downright Machiavellian. So I'll explain later, George. Machiavellian was a guy. He reminded me a lot of you. Yes, you're both Italian. So what he said was, and it was right up front about it, if you were listening, most of my Republican friends weren't listening, we're going to lower taxes so we can starve the beast. And he said that in and around the same time that he was complaining about the welfare Cadillac and the welfare Queens. So what he was saying was, there's too much revenue flowing into the federal government, and then that money is being used to pay these mainly black people on welfare who are shiftless, no good people who don't deserve it, and they're all cheating. They're all welfare cheats. And so what we're going to do is we're going to starve the beast by cutting the taxes, which benefits the wealthy, and then that money, we're going to not have that money available to give to all of these no-goodniks. And so that's how we're going to restructure the economy and undo all the bad things that have been done by the Democrats all these years. This is a guy who had been a Roosevelt Democrat. He should have been ashamed of himself, but he wasn't, because he was cynical. And he had made friends with all these wealthy people, these wealthy donors, when he was governor of California. And he was paying them off. That's what he was doing. So that was kind of the Ronald Reagan philosophy of debt, which is run up the national debt by slashing revenue and then saying we can't afford all these programs, so we'll cut the programs, hurt the people who are dependent upon them, in the meantime making the rich and the wealthy and the powerful richer, wealthier, and more powerful. So that, to me, that was the cynicism is the word I'm looking for here. The cynicism of Ronald Reagan. So after Ronald Reagan left office, we had Jimmy Carter, we had George Bush Sr. And George Bush Sr. Was my second favorite Republican president. My favorite one, of course, was the president who took over when Nixon resigned, and he was Gerald Ford, because Gerald Ford was the greatest president we've ever had, bar none, because he played football for the University of Michigan. He was an All-American center. You can't get any better than that. You cannot be any more qualified as a politician, as a president, and just as a human being than to be a Michigan football star. So, Gerald Ford was the best president ever. But my second favorite Republican was George Bush Sr. And George Bush Sr. was handed this miserable economy from Ronald Reagan, because what happened was, including running up the national debt, They also refused to crack down on banks, which is something you find all the time with Republicans. They refused to regulate the banks. And George Bush Jr. did the same thing. Most of you who are younger than I am we still remember what happened with that bank failure, which a Democrat had to come in and straighten up. Well, the same thing happened here. Ronald Reagan, and his first place, he was anti-antitrust, except for with the telephone companies, but the antitrust bar, of which I was a member at the time and still am, pretty much disappeared because what happened was that private antitrust cases were piggybacked on government antitrust cases. Not my cases, but most of them. And when Ronald Reagan's Justice Department basically stopped pursuing antitrust cases, well, then the private sector antitrust cases disappeared as well. That's just something that's sort of an aside, but that was one of the things he did. The other thing they did, though, was they wouldn't regulate the banks. I had a local bank down here. I think I've talked about this on another podcast, but it's relevant here. This bank was lending money, hundreds of millions of dollars, to a ski resort. The ski resort was built on the side of a mountain that didn't have snow. So, I skied there, and it was a very unpleasant experience. But since I can't ski with the dam anyway, you can hardly tell the difference. But that's my situation, and I know, George. I know. I saw you in the Olympics. So, and stop interrupting me. So that was full on refusal to regulate the banks and watch them and see what they were doing by the Reagan administration, resulted in all these abuses. That's just one with which I happen to be personally familiar, which caused this basically threw us into a terrible economic crisis. And if you recall, then they had this REIT, this real estate. Well, yeah, those are real estate investment trusts. But you had this whole federal program where they had to come in and bail out all these banks and take over real estate that had been they couldn't sell, and with foreclosures, it was just a complete mess. And that landed in the lap of George Bush Sr., who had been Reagan's vice president, but he was basically out of the loop, and he had nothing to do with any of these things, these disasters, and he tried to deal with them. And he was an honest guy. He tried to raise some taxes. He did raise some taxes. The Republican Party was furious with him for doing that, and that's one of the reasons that the Republicans didn't support him when he ran for re-election, and Jimmy Carter beat him. So. But this was Ronald Reagan. So then the next tax cutter that came along was George Bush Jr.'s son. George Bush Jr. His case was particularly offensive. Now, I like him as a person. I like Ronald Reagan as a person. Good personality, and I think George Jr. is a much better ex-president than he was a president, but he did a lot of good things, for example, in Africa, for which he gets very little credit. Most people don't know what he did. But he broke my heart, because Bill Clinton recognized the importance of this debt, and he just went right at it. They had a big tax increase, but the revenue from that tax increase was directed specifically to paying off the debt and could not be used for any other purposes. And he got this debt, the debt, not the deficit. The deficit is the annual amount. This is the total debt, down to around $300 billion. $300 billion, we spent that much in a week. That thing, and then he had us on a glide path with the revenue, because he had to offset Reagan's tax cuts is what he did. So he reinstated a tax specifically to deal with the national debt. And we were on our way to being debt-free. At the rate they were paying down the debt, because that means you have to run a surplus. So Bill Clinton, I think in his last 2 years in office, ran a surplus. They brought in more money than they were spending. And that extra money was used to pay down the debt. So they were paying down the debt at a pretty fast rate. And they were set to have it gone altogether in less than 10 years. Altogether, debt-free. When George Bush Jr. came in, the first thing he did was put in a huge tax cut, which then took us right back, undid all the good work that Bill Clinton did, We had a surplus. Remember I told you we had a surplus? You should remember. I just told you that 30 seconds ago. So he said we had a surplus. That surplus he then gave away. Gave it away. A huge pile of it he gave away to his brother Jeb right here in Florida to use for spur economic development in Florida. Well, that sounds wonderful. We're going to spur economic. It isn't wonderful when you're taking that money away that should have been used to pay down the debt. Instead, he gave it to him to spend. Now, this is a Republican Party that applauded all of this because they don't believe in government spending unless it's, of course, it's government spending which is instituted by a Republican administration. So it just made me sick. The other thing he did, once again, antitrust laws. Everything they could do to undermine the antitrust laws. And I know a little something about this because I had a case in the United States Supreme Court. It was my first one there. It was an antitrust case. And we had lost the antitrust case. It was against a big American company. Had nothing to do with the government. They weren't involved. We had lost the case in federal district court in Los Angeles. Court tossed my case. Well, what happens when a judge tosses one of my cases? You don't have to guess at that. I'm Irish. That's right, George. I took an appeal. So I took an appeal, and the decision was written by this former Harvard law professor who's on the Federal Circuit bench. In my opinion, by far the best judge they've ever had over there. In another case I had that went to the Supreme Court, he wrote the dissent in my favor in an en banc review, which those of you who are lawyers know what I'm talking about. The rest of you, except for George, have no idea what I'm even discussing here. So that was an antitrust case. We took it to the Federal Circuit and we won, hands down. Completely reversed the Federal District Court. Before we could go back to court, the defendants took it to the Supreme Court, and I thought, yeah, they get like less than 1/10 of 1% or something of cases to the Supreme Court actually get taken. Well, this one was taken. The Supreme Court took it, and I went and met with the Justice Department. The George Bush Jr. Justice Department was headed up by this conservative Republican religious fanatic from Missouri. Danforth was his name, and Danforth brought all kinds of right-wing Republicans in there, all of them products of the Chicago School. The Chicago School was a school that didn't believe in antitrust laws. It's the University of Chicago, their economics department, run by Milton Friedman, who I think he was still alive at that. No, he was deceased at that time. I met Milton Friedman at Michigan one time. That's a whole different story. So I have lots of stories. So what do you mean you don't want to hear them? You're a guest here, George. Show a little respect, or at least be kind to me, okay? I need it. All right, I digressed again. I got to stop doing that. So the Supreme Court took the case, and all of a sudden, the Justice Department. Well, first of all, I met with the Justice Department because they were deciding whether to intervene in the case, and they were the most hostile group of people I've ever met. I couldn't believe it. So finally, I was answering a question by one fellow. I didn't know why they were so hostile because this was just a patent case. And why are they so? Well, I found out later why. But in the meantime, I'm getting all these. I'm answering one question, I get a hit from another guy, and I'm answering his question. Finally, there's one guy who I knew from the Federal Circuit. I'd run into him before. He jumps in and asks me a question. I'm trying to answer the fellow across from me. He's down at the other end of the table. And finally, I said, "Listen, this is not a courtroom. You're not a judge. None of you are judges. Now, I'm answering his question. When I'm done with his question, then you can ask me a question, and I may or may not answer it depending upon how I feel about you at the time." Boy, he looked like he'd been slapped in the face with a wet fish. I probably should have brought some wet fish with me. I usually do. So it's like these guys, it was like I finally realized I had to fight back because these guys were just ripping into me. And I'm like, why? I was totally shocked by that attitude. Well, I found out later because they didn't intervene in the Supreme Court. They filed an amicus brief, and what they were trying to do was, pursuant to the Chicago School doctrine, was to get rid of the doctrine of market power tying altogether. Now, I don't want to go into a big economics lesson, but fundamentally is, if you've got let's say you have a monopoly, often created by patent, which is what happened in this case. You have a monopoly on a kind of a car, and you enter it with, and it's a very popular car, and nobody else makes this car. And you say, okay, you're going to buy my car. You can't get it from anybody else, and you really want it badly. You're going to have all of your oil changes done here. You're going to have all your repairs done. And now they try to do that anyway, right? You buy a new car, and the next thing you know, the dealer's saying, "Hey, don't forget to come back here, and get checked out." But if this were done not by persuasion, but by contract, that you buy my car, you have to get your oil changed here, you have to have all your repairs done here, and you can't go to anybody else. That's called market power tying. You have market power in the car, and you're tying the sale of other products to the product in which you have market power. And that's a violation of the antitrust laws. And they were desperately trying to get rid of this. I'm sure George Bush Jr. had zero idea what was going on in his antitrust department. Somebody had recommended to him, and this is what happens with a lot of people. That ran into a lot of that with Eisenhower, which we could go into later. It ran into that with Ulysses Grant. Same thing. I read a lot of history, so he didn't. Yeah, I'm sure he had no idea what was going on there. And if he had known, I think he would have been horrified. But he didn't know. Somebody told him, "Hey, yeah, Danforth is a good guy. Get him in there. He's a good, solid Republican." And so he said, "Oh, okay. What do I know?" He didn't know anything about law. So he had him, and then he let him do his thing. Now, it's one thing. It's a good thing to let, Biden is doing with the President Attorney General. He's letting him do his own thing, free from politics. But that doesn't mean he's oblivious to what he's doing. We all pretty much know what he's up to. George Bush Jr. has basically washed his hands of that. And who else did that? Was Ronald Reagan, notorious for that. So this was going on, I'm sure, behind his back. But this is what happened. You get ideologues. These people running that Justice Board were ideologues, and that's why they were so hostile to me, because they were seeing an opportunity to use my case, which had nothing to do with the government, to effectively overturn this doctrine which conservatives, Republicans, have hated forever, because it undermines the ability of large corporations, for whom they're always cutting taxes, to have this kind of monopoly power. And that was what was going on there. Well, fortunately, I won, and their efforts were basically thrown in the garbage. They completely failed. But I point that out to show that, number one, what happens when you have Republican ideologues involved in the economy and in antitrust laws, of course, are totally involved in the economy. When they're put in charge of the national debt, when they're cutting taxes and cutting regulations and doing everything they can to let big businesses get richer and richer, and in the meantime, doing everything they can to cut programs that help the poor. And incidentally, I'm not really hostile to or opposed to cutting some of these programs. I think we probably way overspend some of these programs. But that's not the problem with the debt. The problem with the debt is they cut income all the time, and that's wrong. So to my Republican friends, please get a little bit more educated. And this whole thing, what's going on with the debt right now, that's a perfect example of the difference between the two parties. And I can tell you right now, it's shameful. And I've given this matter a lot of thought. And those are my views. So I'm going to hang up now. Bye.